Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I am your host, Rajni Gamage, a Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute. Sri Lanka has got a $3 billion IMF program, and there are expectations that debt restructuring deals will be finalized this week. To understand the state of Sri Lanka's economy, we are joined today by Dr. Ganeshan Wignaraja, a non-resident fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Ganeshan is also visiting senior fellow at ODI in London and Professorial Fellow in Economics and Trade at Gateway House in Mumbai. He was formerly Executive Director of Sri Lanka's Foreign Ministry think tank and a senior official of the Asian Development Bank. Dr. Ganeshan, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
So, to get started and give the listeners a context of the state of Sri Lanka's economy since the economic crisis in 2022, Dr. Wignaraja has recently published a paper at ISAS, and this paper was titled The Sovereign Default: An Economic Crisis in Sri Lanka, Causes and Policy Lessons. Dr. Wignaraja, could you tell us a little bit about what this paper argues?
So this paper essentially tries to provide a cautionary tale of debt default and economic consequences for other developing countries in South Asia and elsewhere. It finds that the default in April 2022 had a devastating impact on the economy and raised poverty. And it attempts to look at some of the causes of this crisis, and it attributes it particularly to domestic mismanagement, and finally tries to draw lessons for other countries on how to avoid getting into this kind of economic crisis that a country like Sri Lanka has fallen into.
Right. So you mentioned the causes of the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Could we get a sense of what these are and how you would perhaps prioritize some of these causes?
So in the paper, one divides the causes into internal factors and external factors. And of the internal factors, there is the issue of Sri Lanka running macroeconomic imbalances for many years, a balance of payments deficit as well as a fiscal policy deficit, which has basically contributed to a buildup of debt over time, particularly external debt. A related reason was mismanagement of the economy by what may be called family-tocracy governance by a particular family of Gotabaya and Mahinda Rajapaksa. And that essentially was a government elected on this platform of the vistas of splendor and prosperity, with a grand perception of making Sri Lanka basically a rich country growing at 6% and with very little unemployment. But they executed a number of measures, tax cuts in 2019, which led to Sri Lanka losing access to the capital market. This switch from chemical fertilizer to organic fertilizer, which hit agriculture very badly, trying to keep a fixed exchange rate beyond the reserves that the country had. And most of all, not going to the International Monetary Fund after COVID hit because of worries of austerity. In terms of external factors, there is the classic charge that Sri Lanka had fallen into China debt trap. And we borrowed maybe about $7.6 billion of debt was owed to China, which is about 9% of our total debt. So that's not so significant. But the projects, some of them have low rates of return, such as Mattala Airport, which hardly gets used these days and has a debt buildup. Hambantota Port, which again is controversial and has not been used very much and has contributed to debt overhang. But then you have projects such as the CICT terminal in Colombo Port, which has been very useful for transshipment trade with India, and the Norachole power plant, which provided thermal power to Sri Lanka. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Mostly there, the issue is one of insufficient master planning on infrastructure, insufficient cost-benefit analysis, and political interference in some of the economic decision-making. And then the final reason would be the hit from COVID, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, etc. And essentially, the case in the paper one had is that there is a weak economy hit by twin deficits, which have then this mismanagement by family autocracy governance, and the COVID and the Chinese debt trap push it over the edge. So that's the kind of story that you come up with in the paper.
That was an explanation of the factors that led to the causes of the economic crisis in Sri Lanka in 2022, after which President Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigned from government and a new government was formed in 2022 under President Wickremesinghe. How would you describe the state and degree of progress that has happened since Wickremesinghe comes into power?
So there has been a turnaround of the economy in terms of it being stabilized compared to the dark days of 2022. You have inflation that has come down from some 70% in October 2022, and it's now down to single digits in 2024, mid-June. You have foreign reserves of the country that had been built up to something around 4.5 billion in what's called usable reserves, but the real reserves are probably about $1.5 billion higher because they count a Chinese swap, which was not usable at some point, compared to 25 million on the day we defaulted in April 2022. So that's a significant change. You have the exchange rate that stabilized at 300 or so to the dollar, and it went to 370 or close to 400, and we thought it would even go much higher. You also have the fact that there are no queues for petrol and food today, whereas during the crisis in 2022, there were 3-mile-long petrol queues, and there was an absence of kerosene and other cooking oils as well, and food shortages due to a collapse in the transport system. And so those things are not there today. We have some element of normalcy. However, there is some challenge that exists in paradise, which is Sri Lanka. We have around 25% of the population, or something like 5.9 million people, in poverty. And this is a doubling of that number that existed before the crisis. And it's sort of a quarter of our population, which is a terrible impact. And we think there is also a lot of child malnutrition, which has increased as people are switching to less nutritious diets. And this has caused, obviously, a lot of social issues in the country. And then there is growth that is coming back. In 2022, we had a contraction of the economy of some 7.8%. Today, we are expecting growth in 2024 of somewhere around 2% to 2.5%, perhaps. The official central bank figure is 3%. But this is really insufficient to bring down this high poverty in the next 2 or 3 years. We need really growth of some 6-7%. So we need really Indian growth rates if we're going to do this. And growth anyway is really good for business investment and other things. So there are pluses in terms of a turnaround, but also these minuses on poverty and insufficient growth.
Right. So you have given us a snapshot of the progress that the 2022 Wickremesinghe government has implemented in terms of an economic recovery or crisis management program, and also given us a sense of the challenges that exist in terms of the high poverty levels and economic growth rates that could be better than what they are right now. So I would like to ask you a follow-up question on this, which is, given the high social impact that the economic crisis and the succeeding reforms have had, how does a government ensure that there is popular buy-in? And what are some of the political risks that follow this kind of a difficult reform program that the government has had to implement?
So clearly this problem of very high poverty means that there is still dissatisfaction in the country, while some recognition that things are better than what they used to be in terms of access to goods, the lack of queues. The overall level of inflation is very high, meaning that prices went to 70% and they haven't come down. It's the rate of increase that's not, that sort of mitigated a bit, if you like. So there is a problem with the price level of things. Food prices have doubled. The average family budget is insufficient in many cases. And so this is causing terrible choices amongst the people. Now, we really need a very effective anti-poverty program in such circumstances. We have the Asvesuma program, which has been there. It came out of the Janasabya and the Samurdhi programs, and is supposed to be conditional cash transfers and helicopter money going across the country. The problem with that program is that there is sort of insufficient targeting of the real poor. There is a charge that some people who don't deserve the benefits are getting it, because of political patronage. And then there are people who should be getting it in some of the areas, the deep south in Sri Lanka, the north and east, who are desperately poor, who are not getting this program. So we have to ensure that that is done. The second thing, which is very important, is we have to ensure that there is food security for the people of Sri Lanka. And I think that requires a combination of measures. One measure is really improving the distribution of food in the country. So Sri Lanka does have sufficient food grown in some of the areas of the country, particularly around Kurunnagal or even in the north, but the food distribution system is faulty. And so we have 40% forced harvest losses, which is a significant price to pay. So we have to have better distribution. And then we have these government shops that distribute these goods to the poor, and they're not well run. And there are allegations of cronyism and allegations of inefficiency and possibly rent seeking in some of those. And I think we have to improve that. So there is a minimum basket of goods that the people can buy, which enables them to have some minimum flow of calorific intake. So that becomes improved. And then we have to ensure also that domestic agriculture is improved over time. We have many problems with agriculture, such as the small holdings are insufficient to ensure productive agriculture. We have to do some re-looking at the land thing. We have to look also at technology as a solution. And then in between, I think when foreign exchange reserves permit themselves, we have to allow the import of food, basic food. I'm not talking about luxury items here. So that prices are coming down and the traders don't make a supernormal profit. So I think this combination of issues of making available helicopter money through social protection available very widely to those who need it, and ensuring that there is food at an affordable price becomes a critical thing. And then the last thing, government has to provide some hope for the future, that we can get out of this crisis and move on a sustainable growth pathway, which is inclusive, and provide a new Sri Lanka. And we never go back to debt in the way that it was there.
So it's really interesting to hear you raise all of these different ways in which the current government can kind of improve the situation as the road towards recovery from the economic crisis proceeds. And it is in this context that I would like to ask you my next question, which is that elections are coming up, presidential elections, most likely in October this year. And we are seeing many of the opposition parties and groups in government running their election campaigns or preparing for it. In this context, we see some groups, some opposition groups, such as the main opposition, the Samagi Janabalawegaya and the National People's Power, showing a way out of the economic crisis as one that is still aligned with the ongoing IMF program. So their argument is that they will not exit the current IMF program, but that they would negotiate for a better deal. On the other hand, there are some other smaller political groups that are arguing for an IMF exit plan and saying that there are local homegrown solutions. So what is your response to this?
So essentially, the economy remains very fragile in spite of stabilization. Poverty is at extraordinary high levels compared to the past, and growth is insufficient for needs. So we have to make sure that whatever shape of government comes in with whatever ideology, the economy doesn't get pushed off the cliff back into crisis. And that's a real risk in my view. We have also had constant policy reversals in Sri Lanka and economic mismanagement historically, which has led to this crisis. There are these two episodes that I think are essential to look at of so-called homegrown inward-looking policies. And these have been accompanied by disastrous results. One was in 1970 to 1977, which resulted in very low investment, very low growth, and very high unemployment. The other was this period we talked about earlier in late 2019 to 2022, which resulted in the worst economic crisis in Sri Lanka's post-independence history, with a default, for the first time ever, and the first in Asia, by the way, a contracting economy and a significant reversal in gains in poverty that this country had accomplished over a long time. And in the 70 to 77 episode, you have the point that should be underlined, that people are very intolerant of mistakes of this type. That government under Mrs. Bandaranaike got reduced to a handful of seats from a majority, if I remember it right, with their coalition. And the prime minister of that day got deprived of her civic rights in the future as a sort of a punitive measure by the incoming government for mismanagement. And then you have the specter in 2022 of a president virtually having a popular uprising against him, and the presidential palace being stormed, people swimming in the swimming pool, those of us who watch television, and then the president fleeing the country effectively on an Air Force plane, and then a boat, and then something. It was a big kind of drama. So the people are not very tolerant of policy mistakes, and that's the caution one has to bring out. The IMF program is essentially a starting point for Sri Lanka, creating an economy with disciplines and rules, which we have not been very good at historically. And there is a public finance management bill, which brings in fiscal rules that is very important for the way we raise money, the way we spend money. And there's certainly a lot of room for improvement on revenue administration, also public expenditure to make effective. And we shouldn't take loans that are unsolicited for infrastructure projects at a very low rates of return, be it from China or anywhere else. That's a very important issue. We have the central bank independence bill, which I think is very important, that makes the central bank responsible for inflation control, and also attempts to make the central bank focus on a core mandate. It's not a development bank, and that was a misunderstood aspect of this. And with that, we need a very strong central bank governor from within the institution who can run it, and the current incumbent has done a good job, and his team. And then there is this economic transformation bill, which becomes very important, but there are perhaps too many institutions and not the skilled people we need to run those institutions. And I would rather we did some stroke of the pen reforms along with it. So I think there's other things that need to be done alongside the IMF program to create the right reforms for Sri Lanka. And lastly, we have a massive out-migration of young Sri Lankans who feel that Sri Lanka is not a place where there's hope, which is particularly sad for me. So we need to think very carefully about creating a country that is economically stable, sustainable, and can grow in an outward-oriented manner, very much like Singapore or some of the East Asian countries, that's well managed. And I think that's the hope we have to give our people.
Right. And to take us back, Dr. Wignaraja, on the issue of whether an IMF deal could be negotiated better on terms that are more favorable to the people of this country. Do you think that this is a possibility?
I don't think an IMF program can be renegotiated. This is usually done for a certain period, and what matters are the structural benchmarks, such as the primary surplus, as well as the targets for other aspects. What can be done is changing some of the instruments, doing an annual review of the program. So around the margins of it, one can talk about this, but you then have to show how the revenue or the other targets are being met in the program. So that's possible. Otherwise, the IMF could walk away, which would be a disaster for Sri Lanka if that happens. What it would mean is that we would not have access to international capital markets, and we have debt of 50-odd billion that still has to be paid. And that's something that people seem to not pay as much attention to as I would like. And also foreign investors and others, and even local investors, would have no confidence.
Right. So what would the prognosis be for a broader regional context? What might some of the other South Asian countries stand to learn from Sri Lanka's case?
The first is early recourse to IMF financing in a crisis brings lots of benefits, because the money that the IMF provides can be useful, but it can also bring money from the ADB, the World Bank, and others. And also give you technical advice that's useful to deal with the crisis. The IMF is a lender of the last resort, and Sri Lanka is also a member of the IMF, so we also improve that decision-making. So that's the first thing, go early. A second one is really that you shouldn't use what they call currency swaps as a tool for external debt management. There is short-term money that you get from central banks, such as the Reserve Bank of India that we got, and that's not a substitute for trying to deal with your external debt problems. And Sri Lanka, for instance, got this swap from the People's Bank of China, but that had very stringent conditions attached to it. First, that we had to have 3 months worth of import cover in order to use it, and we couldn't do that. And then, importantly, a third lesson is you really have to have a very strong anti-poverty program during a crisis situation to mitigate the impacts on the poor. And as I said, the 5 million odd people were poor, and good targeting is required. And the last point is really you have to have a very good crisis management capability. And the administration at that time, under President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, had several committees which were overlapping and didn't necessarily provide the right kind of advice. And I think his brother chaired one of them. There was a poverty commission. What you really want is professional economic advisors giving this kind of advice, along with the best people in the country. And you need a central bank that's very independent to be able to also provide that kind of advice. So I think these lessons are very salient for any country that wants to avoid getting into the crippling economic crisis that Sri Lanka did. And I would not wish this upon any country in the world, this terrible problem that we have had and we are still facing today. And I hope that one can come out of it with the right policies in the future.
Right. So thank you very much for your insightful analysis of the situation in Sri Lanka, the state of economy in Sri Lanka as Sri Lanka heads towards elections, and what we can expect to be kind of politically quite active period this year and into next year. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Wignaraja.
Thank you very much.
You are listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, please visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates through social media. We are on X, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you.